In 1991, Sega released Sonic the Hedgehog for the Sega Genesis or Mega Drive outside of America, and it was a massive success. In a few short years, the series already spawned 4.5 mainline games, various spin-offs, 2 TV shows, 2 comic book runs, one of which went on to become the longest running comic book based on a video game. Now to turn a phrase on the often said Sonic had a rough transition to 3D, we're not talking about Sonic Adventure being a piece of crap or something like that. Instead, we're going to talk about the fact that his initial planned jump to 3D got cancelled, leaving the franchise 4 years without a main series game. Kind of similar to something we just went through. Imagine it's 1998, a cold winter morning. 2 days before Christmas, you've been allowed to open one present early, and what you choose is contained within a CD jewel case. It's cold, you've got new pajamas, and the now whirring drive of your Sega Dreamcast warming the room. Finally, you're greeted by a whisper and a familiar bling. Instead of the usually upbeat tunes, you're greeted by wind chimes as the camera pans down to a coastal city. Chaos soon erupts while the music remains dissonant aside from building an ominous drone. There are no vocals until finally you see it. A dragon made of water erupts from one of the many now destroyed buildings. And then it cuts, the camera speeding through the forest, and then you see him. Sonic, his glorious return. You only get glimpses before it cuts to an airship rising and island falling, before then lyrics cut in proper. As we speed into the city, the camera cuts to every other playable character, Eggman, and finally, a shot that lingers on the blue blur, Sonic. He looks at the camera with his new green eyes and a grin. It's time for the two of you to begin a new adventure and step into the next era of gaming. Press start. This is something of a Sonic Adventure retrospective and review. Also, I am using the better Sonic Adventure DX mod with the Dreamcast conversion. That shouldn't really affect the gameplay to any degree that matters for this, but it does put the game in widescreen and change various things to make the game more like the Dreamcast release of Sonic Adventure. I also did not realize until after I had edited the Emerald Coast portion of this that I needed to adjust my recording settings, so there may be fluctuations in quality and other recordings that are taken from pre-existing videos that will be linked in the description. In addition to starting on a cutscene, Sonic Adventure also opens on a city. Up until this point, man-made structures are largely considered antagonistic. The game then cuts to the local police force trying to deal with chaos to no avail. Soon enough, the player is given control over Sonic, and the boss fight... Oh yeah, the first thing the player does is a boss fight, by the way. The boss fight goes on to make immediate use of the new 3D capabilities of the Dreamcast. In addition to having a round arena for this first fight, a portion of the fight also includes making use of the lamppost, drawing attention to the new Z-axis. Soon after, you get a cutscene watching Tails crash his plane and Sonic goes off to save him. Upon entering the level, the player is immediately met with a bombastic guitar riff before it quickly mellows out into something a bit more appropriate of the beach setting. Emerald Coast, quite frankly, is a pretty amazing job of introducing the player to 3D Sonic. The player's starting point is free of any danger and also has a few secrets if they decide to walk around. It also gives the player some time to become acquainted with how Badniks will be acting this time around, as Eggman's robots are much more aggressive in Sonic Adventure to make up for the fact that they're significantly easier to avoid. In addition to the obvious change in perspective, 3D Sonic levels are much more linear in comparison to their 2D counterparts. This, however, doesn't mean that 3D Sonic levels are devoid of alternate paths and exploration. Alternate routes are created through the player's knowledge and expertise of how Sonic interacts with the environment as opposed to more direct concrete paths. For example, through the use of a spin dash jump, the player is able to skip a significant portion of this boardwalk section. However, more concrete alternative paths are still found. Additionally, Emerald Coast also acts as a set-piece showcase through the use of shuttle loops, island hopping, and a killer whale. As something that I also didn't notice until this playthrough of the game, every level has multiple sections where the player is loaded into an entirely separate piece of level geometry, including a music change. This acts to emulate the zone and act structure of the 2D games, despite the fact all of the levels are referred to as an individual act in this game. The next portion of Emerald Coast takes place after the player passes the lighthouse, and this portion of the level feels much more natural in comparison to the previous. And in addition to a wall-running segment, there is now a clear and hard divide between those concrete paths, as mentioned earlier. The lower path leads to a slower, water-based platforming segment, along with a couple of spike gates. The upper path, however, lets the player skip that section entirely, and they are immediately dropped off at the next set piece. After another shuttle loop and island hop, the player can then either do a jungle section or make use of the spin dash jump to just skip basically to the end of this island. The player is then introduced to the hint orb and these jump panels. Also, a bit of a good level design here. The player can't die if they fail this jump panel section, and there's also an alternate route that they are offered that uses springs to accomplish the same goal, though is obviously much slower. After this, it's a straight shot to the end of the level. Upon level completion, the player is now informed that they can play as Tails. As previously mentioned, Sonic Adventure has 6 different playable characters. All the stories more or less happen at the same time, so while the same events may play out for different characters, they are going to be affected by that character's perspective on the event. I'll return to the other characters at a later point. As it turns out, the reason Tails crashed is because he was using a Chaos Emerald to power a prototype plane. This prompts young Miles to invite Sonic to his workshop in the Mystic Ruins. This also acts as an instance for the series to depict Tails as the gadgeteer genius more explicitly in-game. Anyways, turns out this boss fight was actually just a clever ruse for Eggman to steal the Chaos Emerald that Tails had. Eggman then feeds a Chaos Emerald to Chaos, showing that he transforms and becomes more powerful with each emerald consumed, thus establishing Sonic's goal to collect the Chaos Emeralds before Eggman has the chance to. Spoiler alert, he fails. He basically just fumbles emeralds to Eggman the entire game. Anyways, you take this weird rock and you drop it in a cave, and you are now in Act 2, Windy Valley. I find Windy Valley to be one of the weaker levels of the game. It suffers from feeling a little overtly linear without any room to try and explore. Though, to its credit, the level does have a lot of interesting set pieces, such as air running, windmills, parts of walls you can destroy, trampolines, a plethora of floating islands. The level's music has a nice contrast between the calm starting area, the more hectic tornado scene,
jump on panel number 1. It will take you to panels 2 and 3. Jump as soon as you land on a
scene, and the more fun, energetic music of the racetrack section towards the end of the level. Despite showing it off in footage, I've yet to explicitly mention the homing attack, which was introduced in Sonic Adventure. It effectively makes the spin jump from the 2D era obsolete, as I honestly can't think of any reason to not just use the homing attack instead. With a now freshly collected Chaos Emerald, the two head back to Station Square. Something that's probably worth mentioning is Sonic Adventure was actually initially envisioned as an RPG. As a result, Sonic's going to need to collect a power-up before the game lets you progress. The power-up in question is the Light Shoes. These allow Sonic to quickly traverse a trail of rings after charging up a Lightspeed Dash. Unfortunately, it takes forever to charge this thing up. Worry not, there is another power-up that shortens the charge time from 1 eternity to an eternity minus 1. The power-up in question being the Crystal Ring, which is available almost immediately after getting the Light Shoes. While levels usually have at least one alternate route you can take using the Lightspeed Dash, unfortunately having to stop what you're doing to charge up the dash kind of destroys the purpose. The next level, Casino Obelis, is rather interesting as it takes a unique spin on the pinball elements the series has played around with before. Gambling and pinball elements are combined as there are 2 separate pinball tables in Casino Obelis, one based off slot machines and the other is cards with a Knights theme. The Knights table is actually 2 different tables, with unique transition animations in addition to whatever this one is. I will say this animation is a little too easy to activate. The end of Casino Obelis is actually pretty close to the start. Instead of simply traversing the path to the goal in Casino Obelis, the player is tasked with creating that path. The player just needs to collect and deposit 400 rings into the vault containing the Chaos Emerald. While some rings can be found, the vast majority are expected to be gathered from the pinball tables. Though if the player fails a table with less than 100 rings, they are thrown into the sewers, which feature an abundance of rings and hazards. Casino Obelis also features 2 unique animations for Sonic not seen anywhere else in the game.
Wait, so you've been watching me this whole time? Even in the shower?
Ah, that's a trick question. Sonic the Hedgehog prefers bubble baths.
And after level completion, Eggman steals the 2 emeralds you just collected. Nice. I find it really interesting and cool that Casino Obelis decided to be a stage where you can theoretically not even see half of it. That just happens to be the part that I like more though. As previously mentioned, Angel Island can be seen falling in the game's intro, and it makes up the mountain scene in the back of the Mystic Ruins. But more importantly, what it means for us today is it's time to go back to Ice Cap. It's also worth mentioning if you're playing any version of the game from the GameCube port onwards, that Cream the Rabbit makes a cameo here, dropping off the Ice Stone. This is removed in the Dreamcast conversion. The first thing that will be apparent about Ice Cap Zone is that it starts off very differently from its Genesis counterpart. Instead of starting off with some absolutely radical snowboarding, getting you ready to roll your way through different badniks, instead of trying to get the player hyped, Ice Cap Zone on the Dreamcast decided, no. There's no time for excitement, ambient noise. You know, to draw out the fear of freezing to death, alone, in a cave where no one can hear you, or likely even find you. The first half of Ice Cap Zone is a definite pace breaker, with a weird focus on these icicle hanging bits, and other segments that just kind of act to kill all momentum. If you know how to navigate this level, there's a huge portion of it you can just skip. Oh yeah, and the second half of the level decided to want to be a playable version of the intro to Ice Cap on the Genesis. If you ask me, I think that makes up for it. The music also matches the general tone of the game significantly better here. The physics for the snowboard feel really weird, but nothing that's like impossible to deal with. It just doesn't feel like a snowboard. Yeah, it's a cool segment, I like it. I do like how Sonic is rendered in this level, as he has a sort of kind of frosted look, and you can see him breathing. Anyways, after this, you immediately get 2 boss fights, one with Knuckles and another one with Chaos 4 as a giant fish in that lake. The Chaos 4 fight is rather interesting. Because the general structure of boss fights does involve quite a bit of waiting, the player is likely going to just be running around, but for this fight you're going to be slowly sinking to the water, forcing you to jump a lot more. The egg carrier then rises out of the jungle and Sonic and Tails take off in the tornado for Sky Chase Act 1. Rather than being a traditional platforming level, Sky Chase is an on-rail shooter. The player needs to avoid badniks and shoot them down by either pressing the fire button, which will send out a volley of shots, or hold the fire button down, enabling a lock-on system before later releasing the missiles. Unfortunately, Sky Chase ends with the tornado being shot out of the sky. At this point, Sonic and Tails will be separated with the exception of one level for the remainder of the game. Additionally, at this point, Sonic stops looking for the Chaos Emeralds, as his story now focuses on a subplot centered around Amy. On the subject of Amy, now is an appropriate time as any to talk about all the redesigns that the characters received in their transition to 3D. Aside from a noticeable shift in art style, Sonic and Knuckles received less drastic changes, such as visible irises, adjustments to torso shape, clearly defined shoe soles, longer limbs for better visibility and readability in 3D, something that was already showing up in the comics prior to this. The silhouette of Knuckles' head became less triangular, and Sonic's quills became universally redesigned to better match the Japanese art, retiring the more mohawk design that he had up until that point in America. Though characters like Eggman, Amy, and Tails all saw more drastic redesigns, Sonic Adventure started downplaying the egg and walrus elements of Ivo's design, as his egg shape became more limited to his torso, and less apparent with a more clearly defined head and broader shoulders. Though while his mustache was relatively unchanged, whatever these triangular shapes from his Japanese design were integrated into his jacket and moved significantly further down his body, making the influence much less apparent. What Sega doesn't want you to know is that they gave Tails a nose job. This change is less obviously apparent, thanks to a combination of angling and his snout and muzzle being the same color, allowing for the nose portions of his face to read as more similar to other characters. His snout is much easier to see in things such as sprite art, certain pieces of 2D artwork, a few Genesis contemporary alternate designs. This render for Sonic R. To be fair to the classic design introduced in Sonic Generations, however, the final models for the Sega Saturn games and Sonic the Fighters are much more in line with what we would see in Sonic Adventure. Tails also became consistently more of a yellow color, and Amy was radically redesigned, with the only obviously carried over elements being that she's pink and she has a hammer. And even then, the hammer had only been seen one time in the games beforehand, but in terms of impact, these would be the designs of the characters going forward. Now that Sonic's story is temporarily shifted to Amy, the first level is going to be Twinkle Park. Much like how Ice Cap had 2 distinct gameplay styles in itself, Twinkle Park does something similar, instead throwing the mix-up at the beginning with Twinkle Circuit, which is where I am now. This segment is relatively short. The player just needs to defeat an enemy and then steal their car and drive away. Rather than simply being used as a one-off gimmick, this actually gets to be, rather than being a simple one-off gimmick, the go-karting segment actually appears as a minigame for every character except for Gamma. There is a unique circuit, and basically it's 3 laps, and how quickly can you do it. Apparently each character has separate stats, but I've never really paid that much attention other than that's what I hear is a thing. The next segment of Twinkle Park, also referred to internally as Pleasure Castle, is basically a grand scale amusement park that is floating in space for some reason. Outside of the bumper cars go-kart segment of Twinkle Circuit, the remainder of the level takes place in a medieval looking castle thing that likes to play up a lot more of the amusement park aspects. For example, there's this pool, there's a roller coaster that goes around the map, in addition to a couple of other pools, a merry-go-round of death, and 2 bowling segments in no particular order.
Now, as we know from playing Amy's level, she got kidnapped, which means Sonic needs to find her, which includes running through Speed Highway for some reason, I'm not quite sure why. But Speed Highway happens to be one of the most iconic levels in the game. Not only does Speed Highway start off like a Hot Wheels track and drop you from the top of a building, more observant players will notice an immediate fork in the road, pun very much intended. And in case it wasn't apparent, if you are listening to this instead of watching, this level is a highway at night running through the skyline of Station Square, which in retrospect is a very confusing idea. But it doesn't matter, cause it's cool AF. Cause not only is the theme of this level just dope, it's got a crap load of set pieces. In addition to, the die-cast model car thing, you run on a sunroof, which immediately breaks. If you're cool, you can kill robots, and if you're cooler, you get to ride a weird elevator platform thing. These set pieces also include a helicopter ride, riding a rocket through a building, either falling down a building or using a homing attack chain, these bucket things, a branching path where you're either running along the roof or the side of a building with a bell you can hit for rings, running through a tunnel on the highway, and all of this ends after Sonic runs down the side of a building, avoiding helicopters and pillars. And then boom, you hit one of those weird loading screen things and you have an At Dawn section. It could be the music, it could be the fact that the time of day has distinctly changed, something that I don't think happens in individual levels again until Sonic Unleashed. Whatever it is, there's a distinct, wonderful ease and sense of relaxation as soon as day breaks. Taking into consideration that this is supposed to be a levelized version of the Station Square adventure field at this point, it's wonderful to see that this section still includes its own set pieces, be it a quick wall running segment, the tops of buildings, running along the sides of a building once again, ending with Sonic jumping into a fountain, sending him to the roof of this building. And more apparent in the Dreamcast release, this building is actually where the first boss fight took place. Now Sonic's story finally decides to mosey back on to the main plot. Assuming that Zero took Amy to the egg carrier, with the knowledge that Amy was kidnapped by one of Eggman's robots, Sonic heads to the Red Mountain level to intercept the egg carrier. Red Mountain is another showcase of the branching paths of 3D Sonic. The level is traversed through a use of rockets, zip lines, and traditional platforming. With that out of the way, the second half of the level seems to take place in Lava Reef Zone. It's pretty standard. I don't have too much to say about it other than I like it. And apparently these prisoner things are unused enemies from Sonic Extreme, so cool. After finishing the level, Sonic reunites with Tails, Sky Chase Act 2, before moving on to the Sky Deck. Sky Deck does a pretty good job of building the scale of the egg carrier and giving the player the opportunity to feel like they are exploring it externally. Starting off underneath the egg carrier before moving on to the top as it deploys badniks to deal with Sonic, and seemingly falling apart, I can't really tell what's going on here, and ending on navigating the deck itself as gravity is messed with. Afterward, there's a fight with Gamma, the introduction of Big, and finally a fight with Chaos 6. Afterwards, Sonic goes off to deal with Eggman, with the next level being Lost World, taking place in the ancient Echidna ruins that make up the Mystic Ruin. Lost World plays on with a number of puzzle-like elements, as after dealing with the fiery death pit, the player is tasked with raising the water level and riding the snake so that the path throughout the rest of the level here can be lit, with the final area being a section that makes use of switches, allowing Sonic to run on walls. I like this part of the level on paper a lot more than I do in execution. I honestly think putting a couple more kill zones for the player would have been beneficial, as falling down to the bottom of the room and having to re-navigate back up to where they were feels extremely punishing. Assuming at this point the player hasn't played any other characters, you soon learn that the Hint Orb is actually a character in and of themselves. Her name is Tikal, and she's an echidna from the past. With the exception of Knuckles, every character has one flashback with Tikal, with Knuckles getting a few more due to having a more direct connection. As we will learn, the echidna of the past were a warfaring people, largely due to the actions of their chief, who I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce the name of, who is also Tikal's father. But in regards to more direct story concerns, we will learn that the Chaos Emeralds and the Master Emerald were previously housed in a shrine on Angel Island, with the shrine acting as the home of a small population of Chow, being protected by Chaos. Also, fun fact, who was at one point revealed to be a mutated Chow. Tikal's father wants to take the emeralds from the shrine so that they can have more power, but is unable to do so due to a pre-existing barrier. And Tikal trying to convince her father that one, not only should he not take the emeralds, but he should also cease his warmongering ways. Anyways, after this, Sonic tracks down Eggman's base in the Mystic Ruins.
Holy that Metal Sonic from Sonic CD and Knuckles Chaotix and random Game Gear games and was never like just on the standard Genesis, unless I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure I'm not. Yeah, we do a little bit of roasting Metal Sonic here.
As we expected, Final Egg is a run through Eggman's base. Has a lot of badniks and this treadmill segment and these giant claws. Then it ends with the boss fight that if you're not careful after you beat the boss, he kills you, so you'd have to do it again. I learned that the first time I played this level. And then you're done with Sonic's story. 20 minutes into the video, what do you know?
Sonic's story and adventure and his gameplay is probably about as good of a transition as could have possibly happened, all things considered. Relative to what footage we do have of Sonic Extreme, Adventure feels much more like what Sonic should have always transitioned to. Granted, we're a little biased here because we never got to play Sonic Extreme, but it looks much more like it would have been 2D Sonic with a third axis tacked onto it, as opposed to how the general level design of Adventure treats it a bit more like a racetrack with verticality to it. The gameplay of Adventure also takes this new axis into account pretty well, by introducing new skills to Sonic that wouldn't have made sense to have had in the 2D entries, such as the homing attack, something that would have been only introduced to deal with the limitations of Sonic's moveset as they existed in a 2D plane. In addition to the homing attack and the light speed dash, there's also the ancient light attack, which is used very similarly to the light speed dash, except near enemies, and honestly, it's kind of worthless. There's not really much of a point to ever use it, other than the time it's used to enter a level. The homing attack feels like something Sonic should have always been able to do, much like the drop dash that would be introduced in Mania. Yeah, so you probably weren't expecting for Tails to be my least favorite character in Sonic Adventure. My main problem is that we're going to kind of go over it here, is that Tails is Sonic Light. It almost always feels like, why would you play as Tails when you could just be Sonic? Very much exemplifying the feeling of playing as Tails in Sonic 2, and that Sonic and Tails control the same, except Tails can't turn into Super Sonic, so there's really no point in getting the emeralds, other than you can, but there's no reward for it. The thing is, Tails doesn't play like Sonic. To an extent, Tails' goal and his story is focused around the fact that he is trying to step into his own, with a lot of his character development dealing with overcoming his general fears, feeling more confident and competent at a hero, I guess. So as a result, the way this is kind of integrated into gameplay is that Tails races Sonic to the end of the level. All of these levels are just cut out bits of Sonic's levels, except for Speed Highway, which towards the end has its own unique geometry. And for the most part, Tails' story does just kind of follow what Sonic's was, up until the end of Sky Chase Act 1, where after being separated, you land in the Mystic Ruins, has a flashback to when he first met Sonic, and then you go like sandboarding and you find Froggy and Big runs into you. And then it's back to Sky Chase, you take Amy back to Station Square, and holy crap, Eggman's launching a nuke at Station Square. Boom. That's it. What's also rather interesting is that, as previously mentioned, some cutscenes change relative to a character's perspective, with Eggman's dialogue being a bit more menacing. Additionally, we also learned that the Tornado 2, we learned that not only did the Tornado 2 not have landing gear in its transform state, Tails just forgot to put it in altogether.
Now I guess I'm going to move on to everyone else's least favorite character of Sonic Adventure, and that's Big the Cat. While Big does fall under my next to least favorite playstyle, I don't have the same level of disappointment that others seem to have. Big is effectively a required fishing minigame,
which, as to be expected, is a, sharp 180 on what Sonic gameplay is. Big's story and gameplay revolve around the fact that his best friend, Froggy, a green frog, has consumed Chaos Emerald and Chaos's tail, which appears to be possessing the Pollywog Pow. Anyway, Big's gameplay is a pretty consistent loop of fishing for the frog, catching the frog, and then he immediately gets away, all while Big awkwardly does a victory dance, even sometimes commenting on the fact that Froggy has just run away. Aside from Amy, Big has the least number of levels in the game at a total of 4. Those being Twinkle Park, Ice Cap, Emerald Coast, and Hot Shelter. Additionally, Big acts as a sort of bystander to the main story, with it not being until about the halfway point that he actually interacts with the other characters, with the first interaction being with Tails, the second being when Gamma steals Froggy towards the beginning of Gamma's campaign, and with the last being during his boss fight where he fishes Froggy out of Chaos 6. Also, rather interestingly, Big has the largest number of upgrades, at a whopping 6, which is twice as many as Sonic gets, with that being a Life Preserver belt, a rod that can cast further, and 4 different lure upgrades. The Life Belt lets Big float and cast in the water, and the rod upgrade lets you cast further. All of the lure upgrades let Big catch bigger fish. Apparently it does this by simply letting bigger fish spawn. It does make me curious about the exact mechanics as to how that works though, as all of the lure upgrades are optional. With Big gameplay effectively being a fishing minigame, his levels are all surprisingly large, with all of them being extremely oversized relative to what the player has to interact with. And I cannot stress this enough for people that do not like Big's gameplay, Froggy is found in the same spot every time. And if I remember properly, it's the body of water closest to the start of the level, but the space is appreciated for the alternate missions, with Ice Cap containing the only power-up found within an action stage. Big also has a really good theme. Also, as we would later find out, apparently Big is a game developer, so who would have known? You know, he's loves to talk about the one who does not chuckle. Knuckles. Anyway, objectively horrible joke aside, Knuckles probably is my second favorite character in the game. As we know, Knuckles is the guardian of the Master Emerald, and known for his ability to glide in the air and climb up walls. And we could probably argue also his digging was showcased in earlier games, but it's made a lot more apparent in this one. The transition to 3D ultimately ended up turning Knuckles into a treasure hunter. With the emergence of Chaos shattering the Master Emerald, Knuckles is tasked with collecting shards 3 at a time. As a result, the game design for Knuckles acts as a nice complement to Sonic's. As to where Sonic is focused on going from A to B as quickly as possible, involves the occasional slowdown, backtracking, and exploring areas. As mentioned before, most characters go through recycled bits of Sonic's levels, occasionally with new geometry to spice things up. And Knuckles is the best example of the game of it being done well, allowing for relatively little changes to geometry, with gameplay recontextualizing its use. Give a TLDR for Knuckles, the Emerald breaks, he sees that Chaos is involved, collects some shards from the At Dawn segment of Speed Highway, goes to Casino Obelis to get tricked into a fight with Eggman and Chaos 2, is convinced by Eggman that Sonic is also after the shards of the Master Emerald. There's a short fight with Sonic to resolve things, immediately followed by fighting Chaos 4 again. There's no changes between the fight that Sonic and Tails have with Chaos 4. This is the exact same fight, just a third time. After that, it's off to the mountainous range part of Red Mountain, with the Lost World bit focusing on the section where Sonic gets to run up walls, before ending on the last segment of Skydeck, where you actually get to control the tilt of the ship, and a second fight with Chaos 6, where at least the geometry of the arena is updated. As previously mentioned, Knuckles recontextualizes the environments of the game. Each of Knuckles' levels contains 3 pieces of the Master Emerald, leaving the player to locate the shards by making use of a radar feature, and making use of Knuckles' ability to glide, climb walls, and later dig. While Knuckles does reuse portions of Sonic's levels, it seems at times that parts of the levels were specifically designed for the Echidna, with everything past the ground floor of Casino Obelis, the stage tilt mechanic of Skydeck, and the much more open design of Speed Highway seeming to add credence to this idea, which might even explain why the At Dawn segment is missing from Sonic Generations. While I mentioned it earlier in the TLDR for the flashback segments, it is worth pointing out that as the last of the Echidnas, it is fitting that Knuckles gets the most flashbacks. Though due to a combination of writing and performance, Knuckles doesn't seem all that concerned with the idea. Taking my last few playthroughs of Adventure into account, I forgot to mention this earlier, but the location of the Emerald Shards is randomized each time. I tend to see Knuckles' campaign as a highlight of the game, with my biggest complaint being that it is over far too quickly. Sonic Adventure marks a major turning point for Amy Rose. Her other major appearance left her effectively as a damsel in distress, being someone capable of doing the rescuing herself. Despite only having 3 levels to her campaign, they fast-track her character development, with the context of each level changing her motivation of running through it. Amy's gameplay involves avoiding an E-Series robot known as Zero. Much like its source theme, Twinkle Park for Amy is relatively lighthearted, though it does ultimately end in her being kidnapped. And unlike Big and Sonic's versions of the levels, a large portion is actually focused on running around the inside of the castle. Amy's take on the Sonic formula feels a little bit more like he was aiming for what would have been considered a more traditional platformer with light puzzle-solving elements. Pretty much immediately after being captured, Amy manages to convince Gamma that it should let her go, and it takes us to the Hot Shelter, which is effectively a level running around the inside of the egg carrier, which is more or less a Prison Break episode. And as a mark of character development, the last level, Final Egg for Amy, actually has her willingly track down Eggman's base and run inside, followed up by a return to the crashed egg carrier and a fight with Zero. Amy's campaign is relatively short and enjoyable, but I think it would have been nice to see a couple of things expanded upon, such as more emphasis on puzzle solving, and perhaps making Zero actually appear a bit more, since he only feels like he's actually a relative threat about 25% of the time. Alright, let's talk about Gamma really quick. Gamma is baller. You see, instead of being someone who fights Eggman's robots, you are an Eggman's robot. The TLDR for Gamma's story is basically catch a frog, and then see a vision of the past, and then you go and are basically just convinced, yeah, I should just let the prisoner go. Pretty sounds good. And then, like, you gain a consciousness or something, and Gamma just decides, I need to free the animals inside the robots. And I'm gonna do that by killing the robots. This translates to Gamma's gameplay having a timer that ticks down as opposed to up, much like a certain red plumber, though each robot destroyed grants more time. By chaining together different badniks, Gamma gets more time per badnik destroyed. Though I've given Gamma scarcely a minute to go over his gameplay, Gamma is a character that leaves much more legacy behind for the franchise, with Tails and Eggman adopting Gamma's gameplay for Adventure 2. Gamma is also among the earliest of robots in the franchise who end up siding with the heroes. This would go on to expand to 2 separate robots in the game series. Anyways, we're going to talk about Supersonic really quick. Basically, the story amounts to a crapload of flashbacks, and then you fight Chaos Zero. Relatively speaking, it's a simple fight, but is fun enough on its own and is more focused on keeping momentum. And additionally, it goes on to solidify Supersonic as a sort of end-game boss deal moving forward. So yeah, that's kind of some stuff I think about Sonic Adventure. I enjoy the game a good bit. It's a pretty fun game. You should play it. It's $5 on Steam. So yeah,